Most people think of Australia as a land of sun, beaches, and unique wildlife. But beneath the surface of this seemingly peaceful continent lies a secret history of military operations, hidden experiments, and covert Cold War missions that few ever knew about. Today, we're diving deep into the untold story of Australia's secret military. Passed from clandestine nuclear research to remote testing grounds, what happened here will shock you. Most people know Australia's military history through iconic campaigns. The rugged battles of Gallipoli in 1915, where Australian and New Zealand soldiers forged their national identity. The grueling Kokoda Track campaign in 1942, defending Papua New Guinea from Japanese forces, and the various Pacific engagements during World War II. These events are well documented, celebrated, and taught in schools. Yet, behind these publicized battles, Australia engaged in a number of covert and experimental operations that rarely appear in historical records. From the First World War onward, Australia's military strategy included secret units trained in unconventional warfare, an early precursor to what would later become modern special forces. These soldiers were taught sabotage techniques, intelligence gathering, and psychological warfare, designed to disrupt enemy operations far behind the front lines. They were not part of conventional armies. Instead, they operated in isolation, often in the harshest and most remote environments imaginable. Some of Australia's interior regions, including parts of South Australia, Queensland, and the Northern Territory, were transformed into secret testing grounds. Here, soldiers and engineers experimented with explosives, small arms innovations, and defensive fortifications. The aim was not only to test weaponry, but also to understand how troops could survive and fight in extreme isolation, a skill later critical for jungle and desert warfare. Records indicate that experiments were sometimes conducted in secrecy, even from local authorities, with participants bound by stringent secrecy agreements. Entire units were trained for missions so sensitive that their actions were omitted from official military dispatches. Australia's strategic location in the Pacific made the collection of intelligence critical. The nation became a hub for clandestine communication networks, sending coded messages to Allied forces in Southeast Asia and the Pacific Theater. These operations often involved intercepting enemy communications, decrypting messages, and feeding misinformation to confuse enemy planners. Australian personnel worked alongside British intelligence, the American Office of Strategic Services, and other Allied agencies to coordinate sabotage missions, track enemy movements, and protect supply routes. One particularly little-known aspect was the role of Indigenous Australians in intelligence work. Knowledge of local terrain, survival skills, and observation capabilities were quietly utilized for reconnaissance missions in both domestic and overseas operations. Some of these contributions remained unrecognized for decades, with personnel receiving no public acknowledgement for their critical role in ensuring operational success. Even on the home front, the threat of sabotage and espionage meant Australia's military invested heavily in secretive domestic programs. Coastal defense fortifications, early warning observation posts, and anti-sabotage measures were often developed in remote regions, far from civilian eyes. Soldiers trained in these programs practiced clandestine operations, including demolitions and counterintelligence, preparing for scenarios that thankfully never fully materialized, but which remained a critical part of national defense planning. In short, while Australians are familiar with the celebrated campaigns of the World Wars, an entire shadow history existed alongside them. Covert units, experimental training programs, intelligence networks, and strategic secrecy that laid the foundation for Australia's modern military intelligence capabilities. Many of the individuals involved carried these secrets for the rest of their lives. Their stories suppressed, their contributions hidden from the history books that now teach only a fraction of the truth. As World War II ended and the world entered the Cold War, Australia's military role shifted from conventional battlefield operations to covert strategic positioning. The threat was no longer solely Japanese forces in the Pacific or European powers, was now a global ideological struggle between the United States and the Soviet Union. Australia's geographical location, bridging the Pacific and the Indian Ocean, made it a key strategic ally for Western powers. This period marked the beginning of Australia's transformation into a hub for secret military testing and experimental operations. The vast, sparsely populated areas of the outback provided perfect cover for activities that were too sensitive to be conducted anywhere else. One of the most significant sites was the Woomera Rocket Range in South Australia. Officially established in 1947. Woomera was initially part of a joint Anglo-Australian weapons testing program, but soon became a crucial testing ground for missiles, rockets, and even early guided weapons systems. At Woomera, soldiers and engineers tested long-range artillery, ballistic missiles, and high-altitude rocket experiments. Many of these tests were conducted under extreme secrecy, with entire regions cordoned off and access restricted even to civilians and local officials. Personnel involved in these programs were sworn to secrecy under penalty of law, and detailed records were often classified for decades. The testing was not merely experimental, it was part of a broader effort to develop a defense capability that could operate independently, yet in close coordination with Allied forces. Beyond rockets and artillery, Australia's Cold War programs included chemical and biological research, though many details remain heavily classified. Some experimental programs investigated the effects of chemical agents on both human physiology and equipment resilience. Though the extent of these programs is still partially unknown, archival documents indicate that these tests were conducted in remote desert areas, far from public scrutiny, and often involved highly controlled simulations to study the effects of potential warfare agents. Perhaps the most controversial aspect of Australia's Cold War military involvement was its role in early nuclear research and collaboration with Allied nations. While Australia never officially developed nuclear weapons, it became a critical supplier of uranium and provided testing grounds for joint experiments with the United Kingdom and the United States. Some projects reportedly involved studying the effects of radiation on military equipment and infrastructure, while others focused on understanding how nuclear detonations could impact strategic defense planning. Entire research facilities were constructed in secrecy, often staffed by both civilian scientists and military personnel, many of whom were forbidden from discussing their work even after leaving their positions. Australia's intelligence capabilities also expanded dramatically during the Cold War. The nation developed sophisticated signals intelligence operations, intercepting communications from potential adversaries in Southeast Asia and the Pacific. Coded messages, encryption systems, and electronic surveillance networks were deployed across the country, often hidden within otherwise unremarkable military installations. These intelligence-gathering operations were crucial in supporting Allied operations, including tracking the movement of Soviet ships and submarines in the region. Furthermore, the Cold War saw Australia conduct training programs for covert operations and unconventional warfare. Special units were trained, not just for conventional combat, but for sabotage, intelligence, extraction, and reconnaissance missions behind enemy lines. This training built on the experiences of World War II, but evolved to address the unique threats of the nuclear and ideological age. Many of these programs were modeled on British and American secret forces, yet tailored for Australia's own strategic needs. In essence, the Cold War transformed Australia from a nation known primarily for its conventional military campaigns into a center of clandestine operations, weapons testing, and intelligence gathering. The nation's deserts, isolated regions, and secret laboratories became arenas for experimentation, preparation, and covert collaboration with global powers. While much of this activity remains classified, the fragments that have emerged paint a picture of a country quietly preparing for threats most of its citizens never imagined, and for missions that shaped the global balance of power from behind the scenes. When discussing Australia's secret military history, the vastness of the outback cannot be overstated. Its isolation, extreme climate, and sheer emptiness made it the perfect location for military experimentation far from prying eyes. During the Cold War, the Australian government transformed parts of the outback into one of the most secretive testing grounds in the world. The Woomera Rocket Range, located in South Australia, was the heart of this effort. Originally established in 1947 as a joint Anglo-Australian project, Woomera quickly expanded into a hub for missile, rocket, and aerospace testing. Rockets of increasing range and sophistication were launched from Woomera, some capable of traveling hundreds of kilometers. While these tests were often portrayed as scientific experiments, many were military in nature, designed to develop long-range offensive and defensive capabilities. Woomera was not the only secret site. Across the deserts of South Australia, Queensland, and the Northern Territory, smaller facilities were established for explosive trials, chemical testing, and live-fire exercises. Some of these sites were so remote that locals reported never seeing anyone enter or leave the area for months at a time. Soldiers and scientists stationed there often lived in isolation, enduring extreme temperatures while handling highly volatile materials. Entire areas were off-limits to civilians, sometimes enforced by armed guards and legal orders. One of the most unsettling aspects of these trials was the experimentation with chemical agents and radiation exposure. Although Australia never officially deployed chemical weapons, historical documents suggest experiments were conducted to study the effects of chemical and radioactive materials on humans, animals, and equipment. Tests were carried out with meticulous secrecy, and incidents of accidental exposure were reportedly covered up or minimized in official records. Soldiers involved were often sworn to silence, leaving some to suffer long-term health consequences without recognition or compensation. Beyond testing, the outback also became a stage for military simulations and evacuation exercises. Entire towns and regions could be cleared for high-risk operations, sometimes with little explanation given to affected residents. Locals reported unexplained explosions, strange glowing lights in the night sky, and sudden blackouts in communications, all indicative of secret activities happening under the cover of darkness. These events were rarely documented publicly, leaving only fragmented stories and whispers among the communities living nearby. Woomera and other test sites also played a critical role in international military collaboration. Australian scientists and military engineers worked alongside British, American, and even some European personnel to develop weapons and conduct tests under joint agreements. Many of these experiments involved high-speed rockets, guided missiles, and early radar technology projects so sensitive that their full scope is still unknown today. The secrecy surrounding these operations created a unique culture within the military. Personnel trained in the outback were taught not only advanced technical skills, but also the importance of absolute discretion. Soldiers, engineers, and scientists became custodians of knowledge few others could access. Their careers often defined by missions and operations that could never be publicly acknowledged. Ultimately, the outback was more than just a testing ground, it was a crucible for Australia's secret military ambitions. It allowed the nation to develop capabilities in isolation, conduct experiments on a scale that would have been impossible elsewhere, and collaborate with global allies while maintaining a veil of secrecy that persists even decades later.
While Australia's secret military programs were ambitious and strategically important, they came with a human cost that is often overlooked. Soldiers, scientists, and civilians involved in these operations were frequently exposed to extreme danger, both physically and psychologically, and many paid a hidden price for the country's national security. At sites like Woomera and other remote testing grounds, personnel were routinely exposed to live explosives, chemical agents, and even radiation. Even with strict safety protocols, accidents occurred. Some soldiers suffered burns, hearing loss, or injuries from misfired rockets and experimental explosives. Others were exposed to radiation during early nuclear research projects, often without adequate protection or awareness of the long-term health risks. Many cases were quietly recorded but never publicly disclosed, leaving individuals and their families without recognition or compensation. There are documented accounts of scientists and military personnel who later developed chronic illnesses, including cancer and respiratory diseases, linked to their work in secret programs. Some personnel were instructed not to seek medical attention or to downplay their symptoms, under the threat of losing security clearance or being barred from further projects. For decades, their stories remained invisible, hidden within classified archives or whispered in private circles. Whistleblowers who attempted to reveal unsafe practices or unethical experiments often faced severe repercussions. Some were reassigned, had their careers stalled, or were pressured into silence. The culture of secrecy created a dual reality. Publicly, Australia projected an image of disciplined and competent military operations. Privately, those on the front lines of secret programs often carried trauma, fear, and a sense of moral conflict. Even civilians were affected. Indigenous communities, whose lands were often used for testing, were sometimes displaced or subjected to environmental contamination. Their traditional lands became unmarked zones for weapons testing and experiments, leaving long-lasting ecological and cultural impacts. Oral histories from these communities recount mysterious explosions, sickness among livestock, and unexplained illnesses, evidence of the overlooked consequences of Australia's secret programs. The psychological toll on military personnel was equally profound. Soldiers trained in covert operations were conditioned to withhold information and operate under extreme isolation. The pressure of secrecy, combined with the inherent dangers of experimental weapons testing, resulted in high levels of stress, anxiety, and post-traumatic experiences. Many carried these burdens for the rest of their lives, unable to discuss their experiences or seek the recognition they deserved. In short, Australia's hidden military history is not just a story of strategy, technology, and experimentation. It is also a story of human sacrifice. The successes of these programs were often built on the bravery, endurance, and suffering of individuals whose contributions were never celebrated. Their unspoken stories remind us that the cost of national security is not always measured in victories or milestones, but in the quiet sacrifices of those who operated in the shadows.